Hello and welcome to You Call This Yoga. My name is Celia Hartnett. I'm a yogi and a yoga teacher and your host for today, sitting in for Howie Sheriff, who will be back next week. I'm excited to introduce you to our guest today. Elise Browning Miller is an internationally known yoga teacher who specializes in yoga for people with scoliosis, back issues, and sports injuries. She holds a master's degree in therapeutic recreation from the University of North Carolina and is a senior certified Iyengar yoga teacher, a therapeutic yoga teacher, and the publisher of many articles on scoliosis and back care. Elise has studied with BKS Iyengar and Gita Iyengar many times and will hear about her travels to India. She has used yoga to minimize the effects of her scoliosis and conveys to her students a great deal of hope about their scoliosis, their spines, and yoga. In a moment, I'll talk with Elise about her book, but first let's introduce Elise, who's with us on Skype from Palo Alto, California. Good morning, Elise.
Good morning. How are you, Celia?
I'm doing well. I am so pleased that you could be with us today, and thank you for getting up early and getting going. We know you're on Pacific time. I'd like to talk a little bit about your book, which, from my understanding, is a culmination of the work you have done, and it sounds like a perfect book for anyone with scoliosis wanting to incorporate yoga into their health routine. Can you tell us some about it?
The book is a result, as you mentioned, of my many other booklets and DVDs, but I felt I needed to go a lot more in depth. So it's really for students, obviously with scoliosis, but also teachers, because I'm getting a lot of interest from teachers wanting to help those with scoliosis. And I give a lot of background on the anatomy and understanding of scoliosis, so people who have scoliosis and teachers can really understand a little more about scoliosis and their pattern. I think that we often want to ignore or deny that we have it. So this is a way of making friends with our backs and having some knowledge behind it. So there's that, and poses, and then sequences. And I even give a chapter on fused spines, because I got quite a few students who have had the surgery to fuse the spine as a result of scoliosis.
So let me tell our viewers the name of your book and where they can find it. It's Yoga for Scoliosis, A Path for Students and Teachers. And you can find it on Elise's website, which is yogaforscoliosis.com. And we'll come back to that again before we end our program. So I guess a basic question, Elise, would be what is scoliosis and how might someone know that they have it or be diagnosed with it?
Yeah, scoliosis is a lateral curve of the spine versus going down the center. And it also has a component of being having a rotation. So those are the two components. So people might notice it from the front because of the rotation. Ribs can be in front. If hips are uneven, sometimes you notice a skirt isn't even at the bottom because of one hip being higher than another. So it can be obvious in that way, but sometimes people don't even know it. And it really does progress in the teenage years. So they actually do an exam by physical ed teachers. They've been trained to have somebody round over, and you can see the curve much more. So it can be diagnosed by your doctor or by in junior high. So
And,
that's how usually it's determined.
and I know you've shared your story, and I'm going to explore that with you. But first, let me invite our viewers to join us if they wish during this time. Our phone number is 919 518 9773, and I'm looking over at it so I get it correct. If you'd like to join us on Skype, you can go to Computers 2K Voice. That's computers, plural, the numeral 2, the letter K, voice on Skype. We'd love to hear from you if you're watching, if you have questions for Elise or comments about our show. And I know, Elise, your experience as someone who has scoliosis has been essential to your path. Can you tell us some about your diagnosis and the process that led you to yoga?
Certainly. Well, I was diagnosed when I was 16, which actually was a little later than many people are diagnosed because I didn't have that exam in junior high. Came from a small town in Virginia. But my doctor saw it, diagnosed it, and then recommended an orthopedic surgeon. And the first surgeon said, "Oh, surgery right away. It's 49 degrees. That's the cutoff point, 49, 50 degrees." I didn't like that that answer. And I was very active in sports, and so I wasn't really interested in the surgery. Even at 16, I must have had a feeling of what surgery was about. So my brother was a doctor, a pediatric cardiologist at Children's Hospital in Boston. So he recommended one of the top orthopedic surgeons in scoliosis up there. So I flew up there, and he was a blessing because he said, "Oh, you're 16, your growth is ended. Let's give it another year. Start swimming." I said, "Well, I already do sports." He said, "Yeah, but really specialize in swimming and stretch." And he even said, "I even read a book on yoga, which looks like PT and stretching." So I had never even heard of yoga before. So it was actually an orthopedic surgeon who was just exploring. He was about to retire and was having other interests. So he really directed me, but I didn't get into yoga in high school back in Virginia. Nobody had heard of yoga back in those times. And went to college, still swam, did sports. And then I went off in the Peace Corps in
Wow.
Brazil. And that was when my back started to hurt because I was more sedentary. And I met a fellow Peace Corps volunteer who knew some yoga poses, and he was a handsome surfer dude from uh, Southern California. So I was all of a sudden very interested in yoga, and I did a little yoga with him, and it totally took care of the pain in my back. It was almost immediate. So that was quite wonderful. I never saw him again because his roommate and he were taken off by the police to with drug dealing. So that was. But he was the messenger. And then I had another friend who gave me the book Autobiography of a Yogi by
Mm-hmm.
Yogananda, and that really opened my eyes up to a whole nother world. And I had quite a significant dream right after finishing that book that I would be a yoga teacher on the West Coast, which is pretty amazing. So I felt like I was led to yoga, not just the physical or because of my back, but the spiritual aspect. And then soon after I came back to the States, I met Swami Satchidananda in Texas, of all places. And I lived in an ashram for a year and became a teacher, integral yoga teacher, and actually taught in Chapel Hill when I was going to graduate school. And then again, it was that being led. Then somebody handed me Light on Yoga with B.K.S.
Oh.
Iyengar. And I then proceeded after graduate school to California. And sure enough, Iyengar was making his first visit to California in 1976, and I had met Judith Lassiter and was totally enamored with the teaching, with her teaching, but as an
Mm-hmm.
influence of Iyengar. And then we all prepared, and I got to take that first class in 1976. So I was very blessed and fortunate to be there. And he immediately started to adjust my back And I said, oh my gosh, I can actually do yoga to affect my scoliosis. I can actually feel more aligned versus just generally doing yoga, which was wonderful, but it was much more focused on alignment and direction.
What?
So
That's an amazing path. That is just wonderful. I won't say serendipitous because it sounds as if these things were meant to happen, and certainly brought you. I understand how they brought you to where you are today. So the first time you saw Mr. Iyengar, he was younger than how I guess most folks remember him. We remember him in the photographs when he passed away as looking quite old and majestic.
and big eyebrows.
Yes, and big eyebrows. What was he like when you first met him? You said 1976?
Yes, yes. So he was in his late 50s. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Short hair, very fit, and very energetic, as he always was. But it was a class I had never experienced before, such as his. So much energy and so much preciseness and correction. And I had hardly been corrected in poses before. So just his energy, excuse me, would just take you into poses like you had never experienced. You know, you went so much deeper
Uh-huh.
just from his energy. So many people think of him as, a physical yogi, but there was a lot more going on than that. Energetically, he had really reached some states of consciousness, which I realized just by being in his class. You were transformed.
Uh-huh. That
Yeah.
sounds amazing. And when was the first time you went to India?
Well, after that, I became so enthralled with the system that the Iyengar Yoga Institute of San Francisco was just being formed. So I was in one of the first classes. I went to that school for 2 years, 500 hours. And then at the end, I graduated and I went to India 1978, 79. So I was there December and January. And that was quite an experience. That was when he was doing intensives and jumpings. And it's an interesting story because he had given me adjustments and he obviously knew I had scoliosis when I saw him the first time. But when I arrived, he just totally ignored me. I think I was coming in needy. He picked up that psychologically. And he just made me do everything with everybody else. And I started to get strong. And, I was noticing my triceps were really getting nice and well formed. And I just felt so good about myself.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't until the last week he saw how strong I was. And then he decided to work with me. So that was when I, got the therapeutic adjustments from him. So it was quite an interesting lesson in how he picked up psychologically that he wanted me strong rather than needy before he would work with me.
That is interesting. And I love the part about the surfer dude. That just fits in perfectly. So when did you start to focus your practice on scoliosis?
I think it was a transformation over a period of time. I always was aware that my shoulder blade stuck out and my right shoulder was forward, and certainly, was aware from his adjustments. So there was that. But
Mm-hmm.
it was in 1990, Yoga Journal asked me to write an article on yoga for scoliosis, and I did. And that just got me deeper into my own practice because I wanted just to have some depth in the article and I wanted more depth in my practice. So it came from my practice, but the article was transformational in that Yoga Journal had never received so many letters after that article. There was no email back then, or very little.
Mm-hmm.
Most people were using it. So, it was just my responding to the letters, and it seemed then people wanted me to give workshops, and so that's that's how it all evolved. Yeah. So.
Well, we have some pearls of wisdom from your practice, and I think it's wonderful for our viewers to be able to have a chance to see how you practice when your spine is different. And we're going to take a look at the first one, and then if you want to add anything about that, that would be great. So let's look at this pearl of wisdom from Elise, and then we'll talk about it when we're done.
A pearl of wisdom for yoga for scoliosis is breathing into the compressed side of your scoliosis. For a thoracic curve, you place the bolster down, place the ribs of your curve onto the bolster to open up the counter, the opposite side, the counter curve, the compressed ribs. I take a breath in, reach and grab my left wrist, and then I lengthen my left leg, breathing into the left ribs to open up the breath that is often not going into that area. Then, for a lumbar curve, I use a smaller pillow. You can use blankets. I roll onto my left side, which is where my curve is, to open up my right waist and ribs. Again, I extend through the right leg, reach the arm over, and keeping the right ribs from overstretching. I breathe, and I can stay on both of these sides for 5 minutes in a relaxed, restorative manner.
So tell us about that pose, and also I'm interested in your use of props.
Okay. Well, this pose is something that actually physical therapists and even orthopedic surgeons recommend, because one of the big principles is that breathing is quite important into the opposite side of your curve, because often the intercostal muscles between the ribs are more compressed. So breathing has become a big part of my teaching because of that factor. A lot of people with scoliosis have less breathing capacity, and that's one of the dangers, is the cardiopulmonary functioning with a more extreme scoliosis. So the use of props is really helpful to accentuate that. Physical therapists would put you on the edge of a table, which wasn't very comfortable. So I modified it with yoga props, and obviously in the Iyengar system, we have a whole system where we do supportive and restorative yoga. So the bolster seemed appropriate for the therapy, for the mid back, right? The area where the ribs are located, and there are 12 vertebrae there. So that was a good prop for that. And it accentuated opening up the opposite side, and it actually drew the side of the curve more medially to the opposite side. So it was correcting the spine as well as opening up the breathing. So restoratively, I feel it's very important, because it's not just the physical spine we're addressing or just the muscles. It's the organs, it's even the nervous system. So I'm really utilizing restorative poses as part of the practice for those with scoliosis. I feel it's important, just as we use traction as to lengthen the spine, which means you can stay in the poses longer. But in this sense, it's more focused on the breathing and just getting comfortable in your own body. I think there's a big psychological aspect of scoliosis, feeling not quite centered, emotionally trying to deny it. It's behind me. It's I don't have to pay attention to it unless there's pain. So it's opening up to saying I have scoliosis, but in a way where you're comfortable with it. I often use the description of there are trees. There are palm trees that are straight, and then there are beautiful oak trees. So we may happen to be oak trees, but there's still beauty to it. And just getting comfortable with I'm still okay, even with a curvy spine. Curvy is something, it's actually a term that teenagers at a website has for getting teenagers involved. And I really like that, because curvy is kind of a little more positive
Mm-hmm.
than saying, oh, you have this pathological scoliosis. Um, so I think that the restorative poses such as this, it's correcting the spine, it's opening up the breathing, but at the same time, it's quieting the nervous system and it's affecting the organs.
I had a chance to look at one of your videos, and I believe it was the beginning of one of your workshops, and you asked the students who were present to go home and make a drawing of their backs and to make it beautiful. And
Yes,
that really
that's
touched
correct.
my heart. It was such a different idea instead of what most people see, which are X-rays and MRIs and
Right.
medical diagrams. So tell me some more about that idea.
Well, yeah, it becomes like we're an object, versus really embracing who we are and accepting who we are. So I think that it's an emotional component, it's accepting. And the other thing about yoga to me that was the most significant thing was how yoga was so empowering for me because it was something I could do. I didn't have to go to a chiropractor, I didn't have to see a doctor, um, who was going to tell me, oh, your spine, it's just going to get worse, over a period of time. It gets a degree or two worse every year. And so I also wasn't into believing that I could change that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a lot of what that's about.
I'm wondering, I know that often people with scoliosis, at least back when I was diagnosed, which was decades ago, were
Hmm.
told not to do things. I'm wondering if you've come across students who are interested in yoga but have concern, can I do this? Or,
Hmm.
will I be okay if I try this posture?
Right. That's definitely an old diagnosis that, and even don't have children was one of
Mm-hmm.
the things that was said.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think it's changing. I do think it's changing some. I even get orthopedic surgeons who are recommending my program, so that's pretty exciting. It's
Mm-hmm.
changed quite a bit since I started in 1990. I was just first starting to see some students in 1990, and I went with one of my students who was at 49 degrees, and we actually stopped her. She had gone from 30 some to 49 degrees, which is the Cobb measurement, for
Mm-hmm.
those who are not familiar with that. So at 49, 50 degrees, they recommend surgery, and he was going to recommend surgery. So she brings me in with her and says, and they did the x-ray and she was like at 47 degrees and he says, oh, I don't know how this happened. We're saying no, it's the yoga. And I was so enthusiastic, what, we can see your patients? And he said, oh, but most people don't want to do anything. So that was back then, but now it's definitely changing with doctors saying that you can do more. So I think that's changing, but actually, it is true with fused spines. Um, they're much more cautious and telling you not to do this and that. But I have many students who have fused spines who are now coming to yoga, and there are certain things they can't do, obviously, but there's a lot they can do. They can do
Mm-hmm.
all the standing poses, basic back strengtheners, twists minimally, but still it releases some tension.
Mm-hmm.
So, so yeah, I think it is changing.
Mm-hmm.
As far as the Western approach, definitely I encourage the Eastern approach,
Right.
um, and saying there is so much you can do.
Mm-hmm. I love it that it was a surgeon who recommended that you try yoga. That
I
was
know, isn't
certainly.
that amazing? Yeah, I just really feel, I often say I feel blessed that I have that guidance, first of all, and blessed in some ways that I have the scoliosis because I don't know if I would be doing yoga so much in a dedicated way. Because I think the big key is practice, doing something every day, having your own practice to feel, to understand what's going on in your body. Because even though there are certain patterns of scoliosis and there's a common denominator there, everybody's different. Everybody, that where the curve is, what their occupation has been, what activities they've done. So it manifests differently for each person, how much they sit, how much they exercise. So it really does take doing something every day and having your own personal practice, but also getting in touch with yourself to know what to do, of course, with guidance with teachers.
You call this yoga, the organization that Howie Sheriff started is all about adaptive yoga and bringing yoga to underserved populations. And I guess in my mind, I put folks with scoliosis and other skeletal anomalies in that category of underserved populations because of all the warnings and concerns and recommendations about not hurting oneself and not doing anything too dangerous. But I'm wondering,
Right.
do you think of your work as adaptive yoga? I know that's a modern, recent term. Do you think of what you're doing as adaptive yoga?
It's yoga poses, but yes, I would say that it's done in a way to first acknowledge what you have, and then also it's not just correcting the spine, but I want to say this really importantly, it's also to address what you're feeling. Like there may be pain. So how do you do poses in a way that doesn't just exercise the body, but find release? And to me, that can be done with the breath, with simple poses. It can be the simplest poses, but with your consciousness of where your spine is, where your body is. So in that way, it's adaptive. But yet, all yoga can be therapeutic, depending upon how you approach it. I really believe that. And Iyengar once said that yoga is not physical therapy, it's Vedanta therapy, meaning it's the body, mind, and spirit. It's incorporating everything in your consciousness. It's that, as he calls it, intelligence. So what he means by that is not mental intelligence, but more of a consciousness, an awareness. So it is adaptive. It is a consciousness that goes to your spine, but it is basic yoga poses, but adapting it in a way that can address either pain or to decrease your curve.
And you mentioned Mr. Iyengar. Tell us also about your work with his daughter, Geeta.
Geeta, yes. Well, she's brought the feminine into Iyengar yoga. An amazing teacher. She definitely has directed me in taking classes and intensives with her after Iyengar had finished doing the intensives. Then she took over, though he was very involved. He was trying to tell her what to teach. And I could see her power coming during one of the workshops. Finally, she starts yelling back at him and telling her it's my show. So I've watched her, she's a little older than I am, but I just watched her mature into a phenomenal teacher over the years. And, she did a workshop for women, women's workshop, which was wonderful. And then she's overseen the medical classes. Now they call them therapeutic classes, which they would bring in people with every type of disease and disorder, and knee issues, back issues. So I've been fortunate enough to assist in those classes. I've been to India probably 18 times now, and had the privilege to help those. And Geeta's always giving me students with scoliosis. And I had one last time I was there 2 years ago with Parkinson's and scoliosis.
Wow.
So I learned a lot. So you learn a lot of other diseases, other issues that come up. So.
And do you think you'll go back to India?
Oh yeah, I go back every couple of years. I'm not one of the teachers who goes every year. It's a big trip for me, and with my scoliosis, I find it just challenging to travel that far every year. Though I do a lot of traveling, but I'll probably go back next year. There's going to be a celebration in December of Iyengar's 100th birthday, so I'll probably go back then.
And you talked about the mind-body connection, and I'm wondering, how do you see that uh, grow and change in your students? I would imagine the initial interest is in the physical.
It is, but I right away when I'm working with somebody privately or I'm teaching a new class, I start with the breathing right away, and I do feel it's the link between the body and the mind. So I feel that over a period of time, bringing in a little philosophy in the classes or in my with my private students, they start to understand that this is a little more than just physical exercise. They feel better about themselves. They feel empowered, as I said earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, they have a better outlook. They don't feel so hopeless. I think hopelessness is something I get with a lot of the women. You know, it's a 8-to-1 women to men, and scoliosis can increase after menopause. So here you're seeing another period of time where people are saying, "Oh my gosh, my curve's gotten worse. What do I do?" So there's fear. So all of that, once people start to breathe and have some simple things they can do, then they feel encouraged. So I make sure that I don't make it too complicated and I don't give them too much. Just you can do these simple 4 poses. Just do this every day.
Mm-hmm.
I give a practicum to my teachers, and that's actually what I have them do is work with a couple of students, and they just give the students 3 poses, but they have to do it every day. So that's a way to get people to do something more consistently. Not too much, but yet they can have a full practice too.
Yes. And let's take a look at another one of the pearls you were kind enough to send us. And I believe it's a demonstration of puppy pose, which you show us why it would be helpful for someone with scoliosis.
A pearl of wisdom for yoga for scoliosis is to breathe, lengthen your spine, and counter your curve at the same time. This can be done with puppy pose. Stand onto your knees, shins, tops of the feet on the floor first, hands under shoulders. Curl the toes under, pull the hips back halfway, walk your hands out, feel the muscles of your back along the spine lengthening, breathing, ears in line with arms, feel the traction of the hips moving back, the side ribs stretching. And then to counter the curve, you walk towards the convex curve, opening the concave curve, opening the intercostal muscles. Then once you establish that lengthening, walk your hands back, feel that sense of more evenness and more alignment. To come out, gently slide back and go into child's pose. A pearl.
Okay, so tell us about puppy pose and how it can be helpful to someone with a different spine.
Well, puppy pose is I don't even know the Sanskrit for it because I kind of made up the I made up the title because so many students, as I said, who come to yoga had never done yoga before, and if they went right to being a dog and downward facing dog, they'd probably be feeling their hamstrings, their back might be rounded, it might feel, oh, there's so much weight on my hands and shoulders. So I came up with this pose to have the same shape, to have the natural curves of the spine, which actually influences more lengthening of the paraspinal muscles along the spine. So that can affect the spine lengthening. So lengthening is a big key. And I also feel that it's important for students with scoliosis to understand that concept of traction. So what does that mean? That means going in opposite directions, double action creating equal effect. I really like that quote one of my yoga friends gave. So they get the feeling of pulling back the hips, they can even the hips more, getting a feeling of the ribs stretching away from the pelvis, which is quite important because often when you have an extreme curve, the ribs come close to the pelvis because you decrease that space. So finding space, finding stability of the hips, the legs, finding space, and keeping it simple so that they can focus on the spine, not on the hamstrings screaming. So that was the concept. And then the walking to the side comes from physical therapy. That was a concept I had read many years ago when I was going to graduate school, of going, using your limbs, your arms in this case, to move towards the curve. So if you have a right thoracic curve, meaning a curve that's going to the right in your mid-back, you can walk your hands to the right, which draws the intercostals together, draws the spine towards the medial plane, and opens up the ribs. So physical therapists had done this from child's pose, but it really wasn't giving the lengthening. It was just correcting the curve. So I changed it, invented puppy pose, and then, of course, you can proceed to downward facing dog once a student stretches their hamstrings and gets a little more flexible.
And tell us about your time at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and what was it like? You said you were teaching yoga and you were studying therapeutic recreation. What was that like to have those both so active in your life?
Well, I was very interested in sports activities, and it was under the education department at UNC at Chapel Hill. And then it was recreation administration, but then I was involved with yoga already. And I was also interested in working with people with special needs. So that's how I was drawn to therapeutic recreation, which was the closest to what I wanted to do with yoga. So I was at the same time teaching students, just the general public. But then when I was doing my graduate work, I had an internship. And so I worked with the mentally ill teaching yoga, which was quite interesting. And then I worked with drug addicts in Washington, D.C. And then I eventually got a job. It was a federal and state program in Durham, North Carolina, working with the visually impaired. And they were very interesting to teach yoga because many of them couldn't see and they had such sensitivity. It was amazing how well they could do yoga just from my verbiage, from my giving the instructions.
Yeah.
So that was all those three groups. It was challenging, but very rewarding.
That all sounds like adaptive yoga to me in terms of the folks who might not otherwise ever have a chance to do yoga. I'm wondering about what challenges you see now when you're teaching students and also when you're teaching teachers.
Well, with students, it's just getting their consciousness to understand their backs is the first thing, because often they haven't been told which way their curve goes. Orthopedic surgeons, sorry, that's my dog. Orthopedic surgeons don't give a good description. They just say you have scoliosis, it's an S curve or a C curve. So that doesn't give them a lot of information. So, my getting them to understand their backs is one of the first things. And then for teachers, it's really having them understand how to help those with scoliosis. So that's, and I think the understanding, and then there are many teachers who are interested in doing teaching scoliosis, yoga for scoliosis, who don't have scoliosis. So getting them to understand it, and that's why when I give these teacher training workshops, I often will have students and teachers there, so the teachers can then work with the students.
It sounds really wonderful to have that interface so teachers can work with people who have scoliosis as well. I would imagine even some people with scoliosis aren't necessarily sure about how to pass on their own knowledge and wisdom.
Right, right. And another thing I just remembered to say is that often students with scoliosis will get more feedback from the side of the curve. So that's what they want to stretch. And initially that's fine. It releases the tension if there's pain there. That's certainly legitimate.
Mm-hmm.
But there's so much more to this, because actually we need to give attention to that area that's more compressed, which is the opposite side.
Mm-hmm.
Breathing into it, creating space, and that actually creates more alignment and centering. And I think that is something that's challenging also, is for students to feel centered. And that's why the Iyengar system, I feel, really can contribute to that, because of the focus of alignment. Mm-hmm. Just getting a sense of feeling more centered, psychologically as well as physically. It was a wonderful experience I had with Gita. You had asked me about Gita Iyengar. Mm-hmm. She was giving a convention in Pasadena, and I was asked to teach a yoga for scoliosis workshop. There were other teachers being asked that. And as it turned out, she wanted to see our sequences. So she had them sent to her before the convention, and then she met with all of us. And she gave her the feedback, which was just phenomenal, because we were learning about each other's sequences and her feedback. So she looked at mine and she said, "Good sequence, Elise, but you left out a very important pose." And I said, "Okay, what's that?" And she said, Virabhadrasana 2, which is Warrior 2, which is a very centering pose. And she looked at me and says, "It's centering psychologically as well as physically." Mm-hmm. So I hadn't thought of it. I was always thinking of correcting it and lengthening the spine, but it was a whole nother aspect. So now I include Warrior 2. Mm-hmm. In significant poses.
I would imagine the mastery of poses is very psychologically uplifting for people who have been told they couldn't do things or shouldn't do things.
Right, or the curve is going to get worse, absolutely. Mm-hmm. So it's a way to counter that and to feel, as I said, more empowered, that they can do things. And I feel that yoga should not be so adaptive that it says, "Oh, I can only do yoga," but that it's adaptive so that then you can do many more things in life. Mm-hmm. And that's what it was for me. I still ski. I still ride a bike. I'm active in many other ways because of the adaptive yoga.
So then yoga becomes the key that allows that activity, because you have length in your muscles and strength in your muscles, and sounds wonderful.
Right.
We've talked some
There
about
is a strengthening. There is a strengthening aspect as well, and I haven't mentioned that, but that is an important part, because the muscles can get weak as well.
And I would imagine that's some of the work you do with people who have sports injuries and other back issues.
Right. Yes. Well, it's getting more alignment, strengthening. Mm-hmm. Also, the athletes they exercise and focus on the strengthening, so they need the flexibility as well. So definitely important.
And you've talked about the Iyengars. Tell us about some of the other influences, people in yoga and maybe people outside of the yoga world that have affected you.
Mm. Well, definitely many yoga teachers, not just Iyengar, before I met him. And I think that was important for me, because it gave me perspective of the more spiritual aspect. I'm also very interested in Buddhism. I meditate. So I've appreciated that influence. Alan Wallace, a very important, influential person for me. He was getting his PhD at Stanford, so I would do Dharma talks with him, and I went on a 10-day silent retreat with him. So that's been important. I feel like because of my practice, I love to travel. So I've enjoyed traveling, and I teach a lot of places, but I also enjoy traveling and not teaching, just having vacation. So that certainly, I love learning about new people, new places. I think having a curiosity. As I said, I enjoy cycling and swimming. I swim at least 3 times a week. I enjoy reading the philosophy of yoga, really gotten into the sutras. Our whole system has definitely gotten more involved with understanding the philosophy of Patanjali. So those are some other interests I have.
Well, let's talk about, excuse me, your upcoming trip to Raleigh, and then we'll take a look at the last pearl. I know you're going to be in Raleigh. Is it October 6th, 7th, and 8th? And with one of your students who has a studio here.
Yes, Graham Williams. I met her in Crested Butte, Colorado, where I was just on vacation, and we were both taking a class, and Gary, the teacher, asked me to work with Graham, and she followed me around for many years, and then started her own center and has become an Iyengar certified teacher. So I will be there. I'm looking forward to coming back to North Carolina, as I always do, and I'll be giving um, a Yoga for Scoliosis workshop for students and teachers, for more continuing students and for teachers. So I often give a part one, which is just for very beginners, and this is more for those students who've done some yoga before.
And I know that we can find out more about that on your website. Excuse me. There's also Graham's website, which is iyengarraleigh.com. And let's go to our last pearl while I try to get my voice back.
A pearl of wisdom for yoga for scoliosis
Go ahead, keep talking.
Elise, I wanted you to give us your website again, if you would. And when we come back, if we get to that pearl, we'll talk some more about your book.
Okay. My website is yoga, YOGAFOR, scoliosis, SCOLIOSIS.com. And I have a lot of information, a lot of articles on the website. So it's informational as well as it has a lot of my products and my workshops. And I also own a yoga center in Mountain View, which is just next to Palo Alto. So I give a lot of workshops there, and also at the Iyengar Institute in San Francisco.
And I've been able to enjoy your DVD, Yoga for Scoliosis. And I have found it so helpful to be able to work at my own pace and pause the DVD when I need to stop and slow down and rewind it. And it's such a wonderful way to practice poses for people who have scoliosis.
Thank you. Yeah, the DVD does involve 4 people with 4 different patterns. So that's a plus. And then, yes, you can always pause.
Yes. In life in DVDs. So I believe we have our last pearl, so let's take a look at that.
A pearl of wisdom for yoga for scoliosis is to stay in poses longer to create a deeper release. This is downward dog with a strap on the door. This allows you to stay longer, to get the hips even, and also to feel freedom of the spine. It grounds the legs in order to free the spine. I lean into the rope, bend my knees, walk the feet back. Keep the heels up so that you focus on the spine and not be overcome by the tightness of your hamstrings. Reach, lengthen, then you can straighten your legs. Again, the heels don't have to be down. Reach, and just as puppy, you can walk your hands over again to open the intercostal muscles on the concave side. Breathe deeply, and also to counter the curve. And then you may walk back, feel more evenness, the hips are even. So this also helps curves in the lower back as well. To come out, walk your hands under your shoulders, walk your feet forward until they're under the hips. Press down, extend your spine, and come up.
That is wonderful. Tell us about using a strap to increase our flexibility with downward dog.
Many things. First of all, in the Iyengar system, we have ropes in studios, but not everybody has ropes. So one of my big keys is attempting to find things around the house or props that you can use. So a strap on a door replaces what we call ropes on a wall, and it does increase some flexibility, but it also creates a stability and traction. So I think the traction concept is very important with scoliosis, that you are creating a stability, and then you can create a freedom, the counterbalance of that. So the freedom of the spine, there's less weight on the hands and shoulders, so you can stay so much longer. And I think that has lasting effects for scoliosis because you are able to release on many levels, many layers, not just feeling the muscles release. So it's not just about the muscles.
And so, are there other poses where people use straps or ropes to be able to benefit the way
Oh,
you're?
so many. I mean, I use a lot of props. Um, we can use blocks to give more support so you don't go into triangles so deep, so you can lengthen the spine, so you just don't fall into curve. I think that's the issue often is you'll go with what's easier, but that may be falling into your curve. So we use props to maximize the lengthening of the spine and staying conscious of having more symmetry. So blocks are used, the wall is used, pelvic swings or ropes are used to actually invert eventually, to let the spine hang in an inverted way. Bolsters, as you saw, and lying over in many different positions. So chairs. So for downward dog, I just showed you the basic hands on the floor. But often for somebody who's really tight in the shoulders or hamstrings, I'll use a chair, reaching to a chair, or blocks versus on the floor. So we adapt it to be for each individual. Some people use chairs, some people use the floor, depending upon their flexibility. But flexibility is important to access some of the poses that will help.
And it sounds like that's only one element. Talking about muscles and bones tends to be where we go from the medical model. But
Right.
you're also talking about pain reduction, and that is something most people will get from traction.
Correct. Yes, yes. It's not just, then people come to me and say, well, is it okay to do vinyasa yoga? And I said, well, that's fine to get movement, to get the muscles to release, but really to have time to be in the poses, to feel whether you're aligned or not. And what's really interesting in the beginning, students will feel what's aligned is not aligned because they're so used to being misaligned. So there is that proprioception that has to change. And it does change with being in poses long enough so you can really feel, getting the feedback from a teacher or from yourself of starting to feel what is aligned. And then you make that concept of, oh, I feel I'm aligned and I really am aligned, which happens over a period of time. But that, again, takes practice.
And I noticed when in all three of the pearls that the language you use is not medical and very gentle. Can you tell us about that? How you choose to talk about the movements for students?
I try to be encouraging because a lot of people have fear. And so they're just not sure they can do things. So I'm trying to ease them into it. Stiram sukham asanam. Find your stability, then find the ease. So I think that's getting people to be comfortable in their bodies is the first thing. Then I can give them a little more instruction and deepen it and empower them in a way that they can do more. But in the beginning, they need to just feel comfortable in their bodies and be encouraged, I would say.
And we haven't talked much at all about pranayama, but I know that that's a big part of what you recommend for people with scoliosis. Can we find pranayama practices in your book and on your website?
Yes, yes. So that has become a really important part of my teaching. And I have a whole chapter in it with supportive poses, lying down. Iyengar found pranayama to be actually quite challenging for him sitting. So it was really his system that introduced restorative poses doing breathing. And that was what opened the door for him, and then eventually sitting. So I have a lot of supported poses, breathing into the back, going over a chair, going over in child's pose with a bolster, so they can feel the breath going to their back body. Most people feel it in the front, but getting more in touch with their back and then lying on support from their back to open up their front chest. So and it doesn't have to be complicated pranayama. Iyengar first started when the first class I took, he said, just observe, where is your breath going? That was the first time I'd realized I was breathing more in the right side than the left. So being aware of your breath first, and then doing ujjayi, very simple breathing, but getting feedback, a belt around the ribs to feel where the breath is going, putting your hands in different areas. Another breath I introduce in my book is Viloma, which is separating the breath in different parts. And that seems to be really helpful for those with scoliosis because it gives you a direction. So basic breathing techniques, but so important, even separate from just breathing while you're doing the poses.
You sound optimistic when you talk about how you've seen things evolve. Are you optimistic?
Yes, I am. I actually am talking to a few orthopedic surgeons in the Bay Area about doing a research study on yoga poses for scoliosis. I've been asked by one of the orthopedic surgeons at Stanford to participate in a support group. So I feel like there is more integration of utilizing these techniques rather than just surgery.
And when you started doing yoga, was that different or strange or
Very,
unusual?
very different. They would just basically say, oh, yoga is not going to help. There's no research to show that. We don't even believe in physical therapy. Some doctors wouldn't even believe in bracing, which is one of the techniques. Others would just recommend that, but basically would say it's not going to help. And they felt like it's just going to get worse, and surgery is the answer. But I really see that doctors now want to give people other alternatives if they don't see that it's life threatening. If a degree isn't 70, 80 degrees, at some times surgery is recommended. There is a reason for the surgery because it can affect the heart and the lungs, and when it gets so extreme, then you do need to have that surgery.
But it certainly sounds as if even with the surgery, yoga can be a part of a person's recovery, as it was for Howie Sheriff. And, the
Yes.
reason that we're here with You Call This Yoga.
I think it's wonderful that you all have this program because it can encourage people with all sorts of conditions.
Well, I think it's wonderful to hear about your work, and I certainly appreciate, as a person who has scoliosis, the fact that yoga has been brought into the mix, and there is what I find optimistic and heartwarming, this trend toward bringing East and West together.
Yes.
And certainly appreciate that you have been in the forefront of that. Let me mention again the name of your book and your website for our viewers. And I'm going to look down again so I get that right too. Yoga for Scoliosis, a path for students and teachers. And as we mentioned, it is a comprehensive guide for people who have scoliosis and yoga teachers and those interested in learning about scoliosis and yoga and that interface of East and West. And you can find that on Elise's website, which is Yoga for Scoliosis. Thank you again so much, Elise.
Well, thank you so much, Celia. I've enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you, same here, and I appreciate all the work you did to get our pearls on the air and to once again get up and greet the morning so that you could be with us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Telestream's Wirecast software, StreamingGear.com, Carolina Apparel, and DeltaForce.net.